All right, everyone. We're going to get started in just a second, but I want to start with some administrivia. This program is being recorded and it will be available at a later date, so you should get a message about the recording availability. We like to make all of this information available to everyone, so that's the intention there. We do not allow AI note takers because obviously this is already being published to the internet and it's freely available. So if you are using an AI note taker, you will be bumped from the meeting for that purpose. Um, Other than that, I don't think there's anything else to really talk about. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Naomi Schwartz. I'm MedCrypt's VP of Regulatory Strategy, and I'm going to talk to you today about how FDA's inspectional behavior is changing since the shift from the Quality System Regulation, aka Part 820, to the Quality Management System Regulation, aka implementation of 13485 plus some small deltas. FDA issued a new inspectional manual when they made the shift over from QSR to QMSR and accompanied that with an updated pre-market guidance, which is one of the fastest turnarounds on guidance finalization that we've ever seen from FDA, especially in cybersecurity. And those things all came out in February. So there's some interesting and important new things to know about that. The regulatory shift here from QSR to QMSR and the associated compliance issues that go with it are the primary focus. We're going to talk about technical compliance and the audit trail and how cybersecurity is, encompassed in all of these changes. And then we're going to talk about inspection readiness and what you need to do to be prepared in the event that you have an inspection and FDA starts paying attention to your cyber devices in the process. Also, what happens if you have products that are not technically cyber devices per the definition in 524B, but they are devices that could have been characterized as such. They just happen to be grandfathered prior to 524B's enactment. So those are our learning objectives for today. Excuse me, I've this lingering cold and it's really horrific. So the compliance transition, QSIT, the Quality System Inspection Technique, shifting to the QMSR manual, it's really essential to understand what changed here in order to remain compliant. It includes recognizing sort of the key updates that affect the inspection procedures and compliance expectations. There are two new models that come with the inspection uh, program manual that you need to really dig deeply into to understand where does cybersecurity intertwine with the rest of your quality management system and what is the legal framework here. Because FDA has statutory authority from Congress for cybersecurity now, they are going to intertwine it into every element, both pre and post market, and that includes into their inspections. They are empowered to investigate what you have done in cybersecurity, and they're going to do that during inspections, and they're laying that out for you with this new program manual. The scope and purpose have shifted. The QSIT really was focused on traditional inspectional techniques and the methods for assessing quality system compliance. The QMSR program manual has more broad expectations and it has focal areas that delve a little bit more deeply into certain elements, with cybersecurity being one of them because of that statutory requirement. The cybersecurity coverage was non-existent in QSIT, noting that the QSIT was originally published in 1999, and that completely predates cybersecurity discussions in medical devices. The QMSR manual is very specific about cybersecurity requirements, and it includes references to the Section 524B requirements for cyber devices. It also includes elements directly tied to the timing of something being defined as a cyber device. So let's talk about that shift. The QSR to QMSR, really not like a shock. It's been foreshadowed for years. FDA told us it was coming. They told us what it would look like. 13485 has been the paradigm in most of the rest of the world for years. So for many of you, this is just squishing two things into one and relieving yourselves of the added burden of 820 documentation separated from 13485. But the way FDA will inspect to that is going to change. You have two inspectional models. They apply to different situations. We'll go into those in more detail. They have similar elements across them, but Model 2 is more extensive every single time. And the 2026 Compliance Program Manual lays out what these specific requirements are for cybersecurity. And more importantly, it removes exemptions that were previously applied under QSIT, specifically for internal audits and for management review records. So as you think about cybersecurity implications in your quality management system, you should be thinking about what kinds of internal audits you may conduct that relate to cybersecurity. And when you have management review, particularly of cybersecurity activities, you want to make sure that you have comprehensively documented those activities, any responsibilities, and other things that come out of management review, because those can now be inspected for. And FDA will apply all of their traditional thinking about responsibilities in the same way to cybersecurity as they do to any other element, because cybersecurity has direct impact on patient safety and therefore potentially on device effectiveness as well. So it's really crucial that management review is taking into account cybersecurity elements of your product design. The enforcement triggers that come with the QMSR manual are important to note. First of all, it again reiterates the definition of what a cyber device is per Section 524B of the Act. It includes compliance requirements for devices that were submitted after March 29th of 2023. It treats cybersecurity noncompliance as a prohibited act under 301Q. So that means that if you are not compliant with cybersecurity elements under 524B after March 29th, 2023, you could be getting a call from the Justice Department, who are the ones who enforce under 301Q. This provides specific regulatory action guidance for cybersecurity violations. So there are specific pages that we've called out here for your attention about cybersecurity elements that could be evaluated. It's important to note that if your product went to FDA and was submitted, not cleared, submitted before March 29th of 2023, that product is not considered a cyber device under 524B of the Act. That means that it should still comply with state-of-the-art design standards and expectations to avoid enforcement action under Section 518B of the Act. We'll talk about that in a minute, but it's not subject to 524B. So that would mean that you are not explicitly required to submit a machine-readable software bill of materials to FDA, for example, which is a statutory requirement under 524B. But keep in mind that if you designed your product on March 22nd of 2023 and submitted it before March 29th, and you were not, for example, encrypting the data at rest or in transit on your product and it was disclosed, or you were not protecting data integrity and somebody managed to change something and it caused patient harm, that could lead to serious considerations by FDA, especially if there's a risk to public health, and they use the words substantial harm under Section 518B of the Act, which is known as the three R's. And it authorizes FDA to require that a manufacturer, importer, or distributor repair, replace, or refund. Those are your three R's, the purchase price of medical devices that could pose an unreasonable risk of substantial harm to the public health. And if you ask yourself, well, that sounds really esoteric, when's the last time that was enforced and actually pulled out? It was dusted off as recently as the Philips Respironics recall, because Philips was found to have not used state-of-the-art technology in the foam in their systems that led to patient death as well as serious patient harm. So FDA will pull 518B out and enforce against it, and they will use it for cybersecurity, although the Philips situation had nothing to do with cybersecurity. The enforcement analysis here If your device is submitted after March 29th, it will face heightened scrutiny in the pre-market and in the post-market. I promise you. Bottom line, it will face heightened scrutiny because there's now that legal requirement under the not only the new regulations, but under the statute. And the legal implications of this, and I'm not a lawyer, are that any non-compliance found during an inspection could be considered a prohibited act. So it's not just you could get, a warning letter or the usual outcome from an inspection. You could have something more substantial coming down your way. There are a variety of enforcement mechanisms that FDA can employ, and we'd really like to prevent those in as many cases as we can. So you do not want to run into civil money penalties or consent decrees or these other enforcement actions that FDA can engage in, but those are possible. So what are these cyber devices and what's the impact? Cyber devices include any medical device that contains software or the possibility of network connectivity or a potential for a vulnerability, which means does it contain software? So those two are somewhat redundant. This necessitates rigorous post-market surveillance on your part. It means that you have to consider design, manufacturing, and maintenance processes, ensuring the continuous safety, security, and effectiveness of your devices. That is the impact of 524B, and that is going to be what FDA is looking for in your archives, in your evidence, in your design history files when they do an inspection, if they focus on cybersecurity elements. That separate section in the compliance program manual details these things. It goes into specifics and it emphasizes that, like specialty areas like radiation emitting devices, it has new considerations that need more expansive attention. Regulatory significance will be considered when they evaluate potential actions. What that means is for a higher risk device with cybersecurity considerations, if something goes wrong, it will be considered more relevant than if you have a lower risk device where maybe it just means that a physician will ask for a retest 6 months later or something like that. So if you have a situation where a patient is receiving a troponin test in the emergency room, this is a stat test. It is used to make immediate action on whether or not somebody's experiencing a myocardial infarction. That is a big deal. And if you get the answer wrong, you could have serious harm to the patient. On the other hand, if you have a cholesterol test and it says, wow, your cholesterol shot up to 1,020, the doctor's going to say, okay, something's wrong with that. We'll retest in 3 months. No big deal. It's not going to cause immediate patient harm, and they're not going to change your medication on the basis of one completely off trend, test result. But FDA is looking at that. They're balancing out these risks with respect to the device and with what could go wrong if, for example, device integrity is failing. CDRH is supposed to consider an action when the following situations have occurred for cyber devices. If you fail to comply with any requirement, I'm going to underline that and repeat it, fail to comply with any requirement under 524BB2, that is considered a prohibited act, provided that the device was submitted after 3/29/23. That is going to lead to serious action from FDA and probably DOJ. From a QMSR perspective, inadequacies of certain cybersecurity requirements can represent a failure to comply with 21 CFR 820 and can be considered for action if it meets situation 1, which is described in that part of the manual. We'll go into more detail in a minute. But the implications here are cybersecurity is weighted at the same level as other applicable FDA requirements. Those are the OAFRs, as registration and listing issues, and as radiation emission, which has significant dangers and risks associated with it. So these are really, really key areas to be paying attention to. When FDA issues findings, they have what is called Situation 1 and Situation 2. Situation 1 is where they're going to probably take some serious action, and it is usually going to lead to an official action indicated finding. So this is where they see serious, systemic, and/or repeat deviations from regulation. Keep in mind the repeat deviations because this comes into play later as we think about obligations under VAI or NAI, which is under Situation 2. When we think about official action indicated, that is the kind of situation where a poor response will lead almost invariably to a warning letter, and a positive response may or may not also lead to a warning letter. When FDA uses the word systemic in their findings in a 483, that's the establishment inspection report, they're telling you that it's not one little area, that it's repeating throughout your documentation, that there's some flaw. So those things are really important. You need to pay close attention to relationships of requirements. You need to look at evidence that could support a pattern of misbehavior or a set of processes that can't really be followed properly, that are leading to proper implementation not occurring, or that are leading to post-market signals occurring. Leading to patient harm in particular is disconcerting, and failure to properly handle complaints is an area that FDA pays very close attention to. In a Situation 2, you may have less significant but present deviations that may have minimal or no public health impacts. And these inspections are typically classified as voluntary action indicated, VAI, or no action indicated, NAI. If you have a VAI, this does not mean, oh, don't worry about it. No big deal. It's voluntary. I can choose not to. It means, you probably need to go in and take a look at what is being called out as deficient, because in the long term, you don't want to persist with this behavior. It could lead to those repeat deviations mentioned in Situation 1. And if you have two successive inspections that have low-level findings, but they're indicating systemic problems, you're eventually going to have an official action indicated inspection. You really don't want that. So you need to think about how these different things relate to each other and how one can flow into the next. When will they apply which model? When they come in for an inspection, there are various different types of inspections that may be occurring. You could have a non-baseline surveillance inspection, and that's when you've had previous inspections or MDSAP audits, but the findings were NAI or VAI. You may or may not be currently enrolled in MDSAP. I think specifically for non-baseline, you're not currently enrolled in MDSAP. That's going to lead to inspection model 1. The baseline surveillance is when you have not had any previous FDA inspection or an MDSAP audit history. You're not enrolled in MDSAP, and you have risk factors that indicate a need for evaluation. That is going to have an inspection model of 2. We'll talk about the depth and breadth of these 2 in a minute. For the rest of these, it's pretty consistently model 1, except for PMA pre-approval. PMA pre-approval is a situation where you're going to have a quality system review specific to that product, and they're going to dive deeply into elements related to the quality management system for that PMA product, and possibly others if they see a problem. That will also lead to inspection model 2. So these are the risk-based inspection types and the associated inspection models that go with them. Everything else is going to fall under inspection model 1. What does that mean? So we're going to talk about inspection model 2. The same elements are covered for 1. The primary difference is that in inspection model 1, they apply one area from each QMS area at a minimum. For inspection model 2, they apply all of the elements that are noted at a minimum, which means that they can add other elements if they find a need to. So you look at this and you say, wow, there are 7 elements under design and development. They're all covered under model 2 inspection. That's a lot of work. That means that you need to have your team ready to go when an inspector shows up. If you have, for example, a PMA pre-approval inspection, because you know it's going to be Model 2, and it means you need all hands on deck. You need your documentation ready. You need people to know where to find it. And probably you need some training for your staff on what to do when this inspection is going to occur. For Model 1, FDA will pick elements from these subsets. Obviously, for change control, there's only one element covered, so that one will be the topic. But outsourcing and purchasing, production and service provision, these are all going to be covered. And if you think about it, cybersecurity elements can occur in pretty much every one of these instances. Your management review for cybersecurity risk, your design and development verification and validation approaches, in particular, your design and development software validation, your preventive actions with respect to cybersecurity, complaint handling, and most particularly control of non-conforming product. These are elements where cybersecurity is deeply intertwined in your QMS, and you want to make sure you're handling them properly. You want to make sure you're doing them consistently and that you have staff who are appropriately trained. 13485 has specific commentary on making sure staff have appropriate skills or training or certifications. Make sure that you've got a good handle on who has what kind of training and certification. And if you need to, go find some training for the staff who don't. Make note also of outsourcing and purchasing. When you're working with third-party vendors, for example, penetration testers, you want to make sure that they have appropriate skills and certifications, and that should be part of their test reports when they provide you with their final work product. If you don't ask for it and you don't put it into the scope of what they're supposed to do for you, and they ignore it, and they don't read the guidance, and they may or may not, you're going to have a problem on a pre-market side. But you're also going to have a problem in post-market because you're trying to keep track of all of these elements, and now you've got something that's missing. If FDA doesn't call you out on it in pre-market, they can still call you out on it in post-market. And I promise you that as they work up inspectional guidance specific to cybersecurity, they will speak to those elements eventually. So you have all of these major areas, plus the general elements of registration and listing, marketing authorizations, previous 483s, and others per the assignment, which obviously you won't be privy to because FDA keeps that one close to home. So again, Model 1, you're going to cover each of these QMS areas with at least one element, in addition to the OAFRs and the general elements noted. The most significant difference here, again, is that QMSR compliance program manual ties directly back to cybersecurity. So what does that mean? What is this cyber device that we're talking about? A cyber device, by FDA's definition, is a medical device that includes software that's validated, installed, or authorized by the sponsor, the manufacturer, and has the ability to connect to the internet, whether you meant for it to do so or not. Which means, does it have a port where I can plug something in and poof, suddenly it's on the internet? Does not mean that you meant for it to do that. And it contains technological characteristics that could be vulnerable to cybersecurity threats. See, again, contains software. Haven't seen any software yet that isn't potentially vulnerable. So I'd be fascinated if you can, prove me wrong on that. The reality here is FDA says that those words are anded, and the statute says that they are anded. So if one of the three is not true, you may not be a cyber device. I would anticipate FDA oring them in the way that they think about it, though, because you really don't want to get in an argument with them as to whether or not you're a cyber device. You just want to be compliant. The state-of-the-art compliance trap is a tricky one because, again, prior to March 29th, 23, your product, even if it's connected and meets all of those same elements, is not defined in US law as having been a cyber device at the time that it was submitted to FDA, but it's still enforceable under 518B of the Act, which means that if you have an older device and you didn't really think about cybersecurity too deeply when you produced it and when you submitted it, and FDA didn't ask you about documentation for cybersecurity, you are still expected to have maintained state of the art at that time, and you should be managing the product on market today, even though you're not subject to 524B of the Act. So you do not want to have an older product that is completely unmanageable from a cybersecurity perspective that's sitting on market that's potentially causing patient harm. Because if FDA comes in and inspects and they determine that your initial design was not state of the art at the time, you're going to have a problem and it's going to be very, very costly. What evidence are they looking for? And now we're going to apply that stricter definition of 524B applies. You're a cyber device. Your product has been reviewed by FDA and submitted subsequent to March 29th. You have continuous compliance expectations. You should be demonstrating ongoing adherence to the 524BB2 requirements. That's through regular internal audits, ensuring your cybersecurity measures are active and monitored, and that you're following those metrics that FDA's pre-market guidance calls out, and that you're able to track how often are vulnerabilities appearing, how quickly can you disposition them, how quickly can you patch them if they require patching. What are your risk acceptance criteria? FDA is not super keen on risk transference to the excuse me, to the customer or the patient, because those people are typically not equipped to make good risk benefit analyses with respect to cybersecurity for a medical device. And they're expecting that you are capable of doing that. So FDA does not want to see evidence in your documentation that you just said, it's not our problem. We handed the risk off to the client. They can deal with it. They want to see documentation practices. They want records showing that you're performing routine assessments. Maybe it's an annual checkup on the cybersecurity state of your product. You absolutely should be evaluating the software bill of materials for vulnerabilities more often than once a year. You should be determining what needs to be patched and at what frequency. And you should be following the post-market guidance timelines if there is a situation that could arise with uncontrolled risk. That's a risk that you can't protect against with compensating controls or patches. So, and could lead to patient harm that is significant. So in this situation, it's not just a paperwork exercise of, hey, yeah, we checked the thing, it's fine. It's show me the stats, show me the metrics, prove to me that I'm continuously improving software, prove to me that you don't have any end-of-life components that are no longer being maintained. Promise me you're not using Bluetooth Classic still. And yes, people are still using Bluetooth Classic, things like this. So real-time monitoring comes into play. Do you have an ability to monitor the National Vulnerabilities Database, the Known Exploited Vulnerabilities Database, and other databases of that nature to take into account what you're putting into your software and how it could affect the safety of your product and its effectiveness? They're looking for you to assure integrity throughout the device's life cycle. That's absolutely critical. That means you need to have a good vulnerability management program tied deeply back into your quality management system. That means you need a bunch of input sources that are signals to you that something is going wrong so that you can mitigate that risk and ensure ongoing security of those devices. Not just to avoid findings with regulatory significance, although for the purposes of this talk, that is the focus, but also to avoid, situations where you have patient harm, or where your reputation is at risk, because that's also a big issue. In your internal audit program, you should be making sure that you are looking at your compliance to your own cybersecurity processes. It is easy to write a process that is impossible to follow. And yes, I actually mean those words. You can write processes all day long, and they can look really straightforward, but they can also be very academic and not possible for the staff who are supposed to be responsible to actually implement them. If you do that, you create a situation where you cannot help but have nonconformities, and that's hugely problematic. You want to make sure that you're going in and taking a look at your processes and taking a look at how your teams are implementing them and that they are consistent. If there's a disconnect between those two, it may mean your process needs to be modified because your staff can't actually follow it. It may mean you need to retrain your staff. So you need to look at training staff members, and you need to look at how you're doing internal audits to prioritize continuous cybersecurity risk management improvements and to adapt to the evolving regulatory landscape. And what I mean by that is how FDA actually reviews things in pre-market is shifting with time. They're getting more assertive about their authorities under 524B, and they're pushing harder about details, about telling me the strength of the encryption that you're using, about confirming that it is actually following some NIST standard and not bespoke. Please don't roll your own. We've seen that before, and it's tragic. They're really digging into this. And so what you got through FDA in pre-market 6 months ago may not hold today. And you may suddenly find yourself saying, our processes aren't good enough anymore. You need to be continuously evolving them. That means that you're going to have to take a look back and see if you need to shift something in a product that's already gone through in order to maintain its lifespan security, because that is expected now. Globally, we're seeing that FDA's impact in the US market is starting to migrate outward. And this is at least in part due to FDA's very strong participation in the IMDRF Cybersecurity Working Group as one of the co-leads with Health Canada. But that's not the only reason. We're seeing BSI and other notified bodies in Europe aligning their frameworks to the new QMSR compliance guides because the European approach is shifting and may not be fully fledged. MDR and IVDR and the MDCG have been out for some time, but the actual enforcement under them and the implementation of them have been a little bit rocky. What we're seeing is that the notified bodies are starting to pay attention to FDA's approach and taking some elements from that in the way they do pre-market review. And quite frankly, I'm hearing when they do inspections as well. So there will be enhanced security scrutiny worldwide, including under MDSAP. And other jurisdictions are probably going to follow suit. We know that East Asia has some really rigorous expectations of cybersecurity, and in particular, pay close attention to JIS 81001-5-1 in Japan because they're applying it to already on-market products, and they do not grandfather the way that the US FDA does. In short, as we have heard multiple FDA officials say in public meetings, cybersecurity is not optional. You really have to think about how it's integrated into your quality management system systemically and make sure that all of those elements that we talked about are covered in terms of your cybersecurity behaviors. That means continuous monitoring, detecting vulnerabilities, detecting threats to the extent possible in real time for systems that are networked, having a network intrusion detection or network intrusion protection system in place to alert a user, danger, Will Robinson, something is going wrong, right? As much as possible, letting people know actionably in an appropriate time frame to stop doing something if it's causing a problem or stop using something because it's under attack. This ensures that ongoing compliance with those evolving cybersecurity expectations, and important for your business, it also protects your sensitive data. Really means you've got to focus on your documentation practices, making sure that you're adhering to any cybersecurity standards that you claim to follow, making sure that you have effective internal audits, making sure that you identify processes that are not working well and retrain staff or adjust your processes, and making sure you can sustain that secure operational environment for your products and, quite frankly, within your manufacturing environment. And your incident response plans. So FDA tells you that you should have an incident response plan. They do not necessarily ask you to show it to them, But if anyone has ever had any doubts about whether or not a nation-state actor will attack a medical device manufacturer, I think you've all seen in the news in the past week that it has happened, that it was very, very overt. And you don't want to be on the front page, and it's not their fault that they are, but Stryker was hit by a nation-state attack sponsored by Iran for the sole purpose of disrupting American critical infrastructure. Not their fault that we're at war, but they have a comprehensive incident response plan and they activated it. And they are still busy taking measures as a response to that. This is important to have in place, and it is important to test it out and to exercise it periodically. And if you're not doing that or you don't have an incident response plan, please find somebody to help you to do that, because it's really important that you don't activate it for the first time during a real incident, but that you have tried it out and figured out whether or not your plan actually is feasible, whether it's workable, and whether you come out of it with actionable items and you know who's responsible for what activity, and you can actually follow the process and hopefully resolve things as quickly as possible and reduce potential for risk, because breaches do happen. We hear about them all the time as individual users of banks and physicians and insurance and everything else. I probably get about 12 of these letters a year. It's almost to the point of, oh, another one, shred. I'll just check my credit records and things like that periodically. As an individual user, we've sort of become inured to this, but as a manufacturer of a product that could be affected, that could lead to safety issues, you can't have a blasé attitude about incident response. It's just not possible. You can't function in this world today with that. So, emphasis, global compliance strategy. You can't assume that FDA is going to be the only one taking rigor in pre and post-market considerations with cybersecurity. It's not true anymore. You need to have proactive strategies, and they should be, as much as possible, following international standards so that you have one approach that you apply globally, and you don't need to try to have a US carve out, a Brazil carve out, a Canada carve out, a Japan carve out. That is a nightmare for your staff to maintain. Try to keep these things harmonized as much as possible. And that is the intention of FDA working with IMDRF, is to achieve as much harmony as possible to minimize the burden for your teams, for your quality team, your cybersecurity team, your R&D team, your regulatory team, to manage all of this. Try to keep proactive strategies in place, and to the extent possible, use a real framework, a standardized framework for your secure product development practices, like, for example, 81001-5-1, so that you're not putting pieces together from various disparate sources and trying to make them work well. The international standards have done a pretty good job of bringing the right elements to play. What happens when FDA does enforce? Again, you have official action indicated on the one hand. That's bad news. Now you've got a fire drill and all hands on deck situation. Or you have a VAI, NAI situation. If it's no action indicated, you may choose to do nothing. Or you might have really minor deviations that, as a company with a quality attitude, you decide we can't tolerate those and we're going to do something about it. With voluntary action indicated, I would say personally, as a CQA, a certified quality auditor, I'd still want you to do something about it. I'd want to see corrective actions. I'd want to see consideration for preventive actions, maybe a full-blown CAPA about those deficiencies, but they're minor. They're not going to cause a patient to die tomorrow or to lose a limb or an eye or something else that's pretty critical to them living their life. In an OAI, there is no question. You have a bunch of things you need to do. And if that word systematic or systemic shows up in a warning letter or in your 483 before you even get to a warning letter, you've got to do holistic things within your QMS to fix what is wrong, what is cited, because this is really going to be critical in terms of preventing that escalation from FDA, pushing you up to a warning letter, or worse, handing off to DOJ, looking for a consent decree, looking for an injunction, putting your products in warehouses and locking them down. FDA is allowed to do that, and they do when they need to. They will take entire product lines off the market. And quite frankly, they can put you on an import alert if you're an outside manufacturer selling into the US market. I personally am responsible for one of those. So when I say this can happen, you can escalate from a warning letter to an import alert, or they can come together at the same time. It does not matter to FDA what the ordering is there per se. They can escalate if they need to, and if they feel that you're being non-responsive, or worse, if you respond in a way that makes them even more concerned about what you're answering in your response to a 483, to a warning letter, or some other citation. Directed inspections are not necessarily something that you will understand is happening when it happens. If FDA comes in for a regular inspection, it will be scheduled, you'll know about it. If they come in for a directed inspection, you may just get a call saying, hey, we're about to inspect. They may not tell you that they have some signal in advance that they're coming to look for. They certainly won't tell you if there's a whistleblower complaint, because that has to be maintained as confidential, and it's extremely privileged information. But there have been cybersecurity related whistleblower complaints to FDA, and those have led to directed inspections. And you need to be aware when staff members raise concerns and don't see action taken, and this goes back to questions about management review. If you're not following through and somebody decides that it is important from a safety perspective that these issues be uncovered and they whistleblow on you, you will have an inspection, and it will be associated with cybersecurity, and they will dig very deeply into whatever is going on, because they need to understand if there's a situation that poses harm to patients, what is going on, and what element of your quality management system is breaking down. So you can have any type of signal, complaints, MDR reporting, failure to report under MDR when you should, but evidence through, MedSun reporting or something else that there's some harm that's taking place. Patient deaths, something that makes the newspaper but isn't reported under the normal channels. Typically, doctors will report these things, but sometimes the news is the first place that FDA hears about these situations. Those signals are the single thread FDA starts to pull on that leads them to direct an inspection. And it can have specific post-market data or reports, or they can have a general bad feeling, like that spidey sense that something is wrong, that makes them perk up and say, we need to start writing down all the things we're worried about with this company. A whistleblower complaint can trigger an inspection. It can expose potential regulatory violations or cybersecurity issues that may otherwise not be detected by FDA through traditional signals. FDA has a bunch of different tactics for gathering evidence incrementally. They will not reveal that there is a whistleblower. They certainly won't give you the identity of that person. They don't want any blowback. They want to ensure that their investigation protects people who are willing to report concerns. And you should too, quite frankly, because it has an effect on your company quality attitude and your morale. So, bottom line, with, with the QMSR, the Compliance Program Manual is a shift. It explicitly addresses cybersecurity because they will overtly be looking at cybersecurity. They'll be looking at it throughout your design life cycle. All of those different elements that are mentioned under the Model 2 inspection, those are places where you need to look at how cybersecurity ties into them and how you're documenting them. You need to look at whether or not you're applying the state of the art. Even if your product at that time was not subject to 524B of the Act, if you make a change to it and add new features that require new FDA review, you now have to go back and create all of those cybersecurity artifacts that you didn't create the first time it was submitted. So for example, a new 510K where you add a new feature set, you're going to have to create all of the elements that you have to attach in the eStar submission for those. And now you have to apply cybersecurity processes that you previously may not have been applying. All of that comes into play, and now that product can be inspected under the criteria 524B during a traditional inspection, or worse, a directed inspection. If you have a class 3 product and you have PMA supplements, you will be subject to cybersecurity expectations with the first PMA supplement that comes in after March 29th of 2023. So even if your PMA was approved in 2000, which would be a long, long time ago, your device changes in 2026 can make the whole product subject to 524B of the Act if they have cybersecurity implications, and the device could be defined as a cyber device today, according to your newest supplement. So you do need to go back and review, what are your potentially transitional or legacy elements in your inventory that may eventually have some kind of change that necessitates re-review by FDA, and how are you going to apply all of these cybersecurity expectations retroactively to those designs? It's not a small effort when you come down to that. So I want to leave some time at this point for questions, for discussion. We're basically at the end of the presentation. Very excited to see if anyone has questions about all of this, and what your understanding and interpretation of the new QMSR expectations are for you, whether or not you think there are cybersecurity questions that haven't been adequately addressed by FDA, or by my presentation. I'm not seeing any questions from everybody. I'm happy to stay on for a few minutes in case anyone churns something up that's interesting. But if there's no questions, you all are free to leave. And yes, we will be sending out the slide deck. I believe it will be attached as a PDF. There should be a follow-up email that explains where you can access the recording, and it typically will include a PDF. So that one is live. Anonymous attendee asks, many companies don't do a proper cybersecurity post-market surveillance based on the SBOM. Oh, you are correct. That is true. Many don't. If you're not doing it today, and you know you're not doing it today, please, please, please go back to your management and say, egad, if we get inspected, and we may be due for a regular inspection, and we may even be inspected under MDSAP, we need to be evaluating our software bill of materials. And if you don't have good tooling for that, or you have tooling for it, but it generates a lot of false positives, please raise your hand and ask around. Somebody you know, or somebody we know, will be able to help you figure out how to do it better, because you do not want to be managing. I'm going to give a ridiculous example, and it's true. You do not want to have a software bill of materials with several thousand elements, several thousand components that churns out 3 million vulnerabilities. I'm not joking. This truly happened. It was a misconfiguration in the tool they were using, but 3 million vulnerabilities, like that's ridiculous. How are you going to triage that? So you do want to make sure that you have an appropriate cybersecurity post-market surveillance program, and it's not solely based on the software bill of materials and the NVD and the CAV and exploit DB and other sources. It also is related to MDR reporting and other sources of signals, HISAC notifications, MedISAL notifications. It is incumbent upon you to identify all of the appropriate signal types that are inputs into your process and make sure your process can accommodate them all, especially including coordinated vulnerability disclosure processes. You should have a CVD process. It should be published on your website. A researcher who happens to trip over something cool in your product should know how to reach out to you, and you should have a process to manage that. Another anonymous attendee said, would it be acceptable not to consider a cyber device a device if it has no external interface at all? Oh, that's tricky. We'd have to get into a little bit more details to figure out like what can actually be considered exempt from being a cyber device. But the running joke around MedCrypt is Naomi likes to talk about the Dremel tool. If I can grind your case open and access something in there and, stick a logic probe in and start reading your data off of a bus, or worse, inject data into your system through some pins. And we jokingly talk about, me playing with electronics, but they're sitting on my desk. That's just an Arduino. Um, if I can get into your system and inject stuff, even if I have to crack the case, you have an interface and I got to it. The fact that you have software on there and that I could potentially change it and change its behavior may make you a cyber device. So external interfaces, theoretically, maybe not a cyber device. If I can activate them by busting into it internally and a user continues to use the product, you may have a serious problem. Be very, very careful about that one. And if you have questions, go ask FDA in a QSIB. They're free. There's a reason for them. Please, please use them. Another question, is there any specific guidance on security to safety linkage? It's quite high level now. When you look at your processes, and this is tricky, FDA's guidance says specifically you should have a separate security assessment for risk from your safety assessment for risk. These are parallel processes. They have different behaviors. One is probabilistic. You can actually say, I ran the software 10,000 times and only one time in 10,000 did a particular thing occur. You can't do that with cybersecurity because today everything is hunky-dory and tomorrow you have a 0 day and now you have remote code execution and oops, now I have a dead patient, right? So we don't do probabilistic models in cybersecurity risk assessment. When we hand over from cybersecurity risk to safety risk, we have to do it very intentionally. We have to try to have similar mappings of a 5x5 risk structure and acceptance criteria that are the same in order to map one into the other. But you take your cyber risks and you look at the ones that have impact to safety, what's remaining, hand it over to your 14971 analysis. You're not talking severity of risk to the patient when you look at this side. You're talking about exploitability and the severity of risk to the data asset. When you hand it over to the safety side, these guys say, if you can change my troponin results in a significant way, I can have a patient die. Now we get into the severity of patient harm. But you're not using probabilistic models to assess what's the likelihood of occurrence. You're talking about exploitability, and you have to be very deliberate in how you hand over between those two policies and procedures. You need to overtly explain, when I move it from here over to here, this is what happens. And that can be tricky. And sometimes FDA doesn't agree with how you do it. We have a question about whether FDA requires FIPS 140-3 for approved cryptography. If it is not an evaluated cryptographic method, you are very likely to get a red flag from FDA. FIPS 140-3 or not, if you tell FDA, I have a proprietary cryptographic algorithm, they're going to say, okay, show me the analysis. And you're going to go, oh, I don't know how to do that. Don't write your own crypto. The specific expectations are that it be a validated algorithm. Is it easier to just say, did NIST evaluate it? Oh, yeah. If NIST didn't evaluate it, now you have to go in and say, well, who did? And what are their qualifications? And why should you trust them? Just stick with NIST approved for cryptographic methods. And beware, this is very important, beware that if you are selling to the US government by 2030, you're going to have a mechanism to shift to post-quantum crypto algorithms, even though those are somewhat in flux today, right? They're not fully vetted, but you need to be prepared for your processors on board your system to be able to handle post-quantum crypto, because 2030 comes and you're selling to the US government and you can't do post-quantum crypto, you are locked out. They will not procure from you. That's it. That's the end of line for your sales to that particular entity. So it is really important that you not just build for today's security, but that you be thinking about the potential needs in the future and how you're going to have to escalate your capabilities to be able to keep up with the shifts in the threat environment. So an anonymous attendee asked again, are you going to be able to access the recording? You will get an email that tells you how to access the recording and that will share the slide deck with you in PDF format. Anonymous attendee asks, if we store our SAMD device output reports in AWS buckets, is AWS outside the boundary of the device? Nope. Your instance is where the device stores those elements. It is within the elements that you have to consider, both in pre-market and post-market, because if that data is modified in those stores, whether because you did something wrong or AWS did something wrong, you're responsible for it. So it may not be, deliberately the trust boundary of the element, but if it's SAMD and it's the actual instance of your software and it's in AWS, that is your device. And if it's a set of reports that are going into it that are being used for other purposes, but they have a downstream effect either to how you change your device or to reporting to a physician or to the patient, you need to protect that data. And you need to work very carefully with your cloud service provider, whether it's AWS or Azure or Google or somebody else, to make sure that they have appropriate methods, that they have an appropriate quality management system, that they have appropriate controls, and that they are adapting. You don't necessarily need their full software bill of materials, but boy, it's nice to have it to understand, and they evolve rapidly. So it can be really tricky to keep up with what are they doing. At the very least, you need a timestamp of the day of that I submit. What did they say that they had built into it? Because if something goes wrong, and none of these cloud service providers have ever had widespread outages like last year on the East Coast, or had a server center in the Middle East go down during a war just a few weeks ago. You have to account for that, and you need some sense of reliability, and you need your belt and suspenders. You want some backups in place. So you do need to consider how the AWS services support your story of safe, effective, and secure, which are your 3 bars today. Because 524B of the Act says safe and effective is no longer enough to ensure safety for patients. CVD posting. Why do they need to be posted on a website from FDA's perspective? Technically, I don't think FDA says you have to have it on your website. Pretty sure FDA just says you need to have the ability for a researcher to contact you. It's easiest to put it on a web page because anybody who has access to the internet and web browsers can see that there's a means to contact you. If you make it really hard for them to figure out how to contact you, here's a researcher who found something cool and they want to get credit for it. Do you want them to surprise you at Black Hat or DEF CON or some other conference and be like, hey, I found a bug. These guys have this vulnerability. I can drive their self-driving, wheelchair down a stairwell. True story. You don't want that to happen without them being able to find you and tell you about it. And the harder you make it for them to find you, the less effort they're going to put into it. Eventually, you're just going to be on the front page of the Post because you failed the post test and you made it hard for them to reach out to you. So no, it doesn't have to be on your website, but it really should be accessible to the public. And the internet is how we do that today. What is the difference between a bug bounty and CVD? That's a little bit outside of my sweet spot. My understanding with respect to a bug bounty is that you are encouraging people to give you specific feedback about software bugs, which may or may not also be related to cybersecurity. But a coordinated vulnerability disclosure is a very intentional program where you are telling them if they tell you about a problem, you're going to follow a very specific process to make sure that you can confirm that the problem is real, that it actually causes a problem with your system, that it creates a true failure mode, and that you're going to communicate about it and share information about it and give them credit for it publicly to some extent at some point, somewhere. And that if you need to, you're going to engage with regulatory bodies. You might engage with FDA. You may also engage with CISA. Bug bounties just offer a cash reward and try and encourage people to report or find bugs, but they may not even be specific to cybersecurity. So if anybody has any additional context that they'd like to add to that, please feel free to use the chat. Again, bug bounty is not my sweet spot, but that's my understanding of it. What about legacy medical device security? Oh, we could spend an entire day talking about legacy. Um, does QMSR apply totally to a legacy device? Yes, sort of, right? So your product that is already on market, and let's not talk about true legacy definition just yet. You've got a product, it's already on market, it's been on market for a while. It may or may not be legacy by the definitions of the standards, which is where I like to fall back to. Does it, does the QMSR apply to it? Well, I mean, if you were cleared under the QSR and your entire quality management system has had to shift to the QMSR, I would think that I would apply the QMSR retroactively. They're not really that different, so I don't think there's a big deal there. Will FDA inspect that particular device's design history file in accordance with the new QMSR manual? Yes, they will, but if 524B of the Act did not apply to the product because of the timing that it was submitted last to FDA, they will not apply 524B elements to it. They're still going to use all the other QMSR elements. So yeah, it still applies to your other products. Now, what is a legacy device? By standards definitions, it's something that can no longer be maintained as cyber secure. Is that different than the way that we think of legacy as, well, it's really old and maybe I can't even buy some of the parts anymore? Different question. Um, One question, based on the recent event at Stryker, I assume FDA inspection would also focus on other enterprise processes that can affect the device security. Oh, that's really complicated. FDA is going to focus on your quality management system to the extent that that's intertwined with IT security processes, which is largely, but not solely, what happened with the Stryker incident. It gets complicated, right? I mean, they were attacked through a mobile device management tool, and that wiped out devices, according to the news cycle. It is not clear, and Stryker, I think, has been somewhat vague as to whether some of those were medical devices or not, or if those were just laptops, mobile phones, tablets being used by staff to perform their regular duties. It is not clear that there were no medical devices affected by that. There may be medical devices that are under MDM control that were affected. I don't know the answer to that question, and I'm not going to ask anyone at Stryker to tell me. I don't think that they will communicate that information unless they're required to. But would FDA look at enterprise processes? It depends. It depends on how intertwined your enterprise processes are with medical device elements. If you have medical devices that are deeply intertwined with your enterprise IT, oh, yes, absolutely, that would be affected here. But your processes should be very, very clear about those boundaries. And that's going to be a tricky one in terms of different companies and different product lines and different ways that they manage the separation between device lines and enterprise IT infrastructure. It gets really, really muddy really fast. If you are responding to a CVE reported by industry, do you still need to report to CISA, Med ISO, etc.? Or CVD is only about reporting a vulnerability in a proprietary system? Is that original CVE actually meant to be a CVD? So coordinated vulnerability disclosure does not always have to be reported to CISA or MedISAL or even FDA, or quite frankly, your customers. It depends on the situation. It depends on whether or not there's a necessity to communicate the information and whether there is something that somebody can do about the information provided in the coordinated vulnerability disclosure. If you call me up and you say, hey, I just heard about this Urgent 11 thing. I was at FDA when it happened, so boy, was that fun. Yes, you can do something about that. And you need to communicate immediately to your customers. Forget CISA and MedISAL and HISAC. Straight to customers. Get this thing off the network right now. There's a remote code execution. You do not want your IVD system to be tampered with. That was my day for several days. So it depends on who and how and when and why you're reporting as to whether or not you can stop something. I think that's the last question. Thank you very much for participating. I really appreciate the engagement. If you have any questions after the fact, please let us know. Email us at info@medcrypt.com and we'll try and follow up. Thank you. Have a great day.